So my lessons are aligned with the learning segment goal, which is to be able to find significant details that support the main idea. And so in lesson one, I am pretty much going through the whole process of finding significant details that support the main idea. We'll have a model, guided and unguided practice throughout the lesson. And then in that lesson, we're going to show what significant details are. We're going to define what significant details are. We're going to talk about what they can be, what they look like, and what we do when we find them. And then after that, we will talk about what we do with our significant details and main idea, which is putting them into a cluster diagram to help students make those visual connections so they understand that the significant details support the main idea. So lesson 1 aligns with lesson 2 and 3 because lesson 1 is what's going to be overall retaught in lessons 2 and 3. Just lessons 2 and 3 are sequenced a little bit differently. So lesson 2 is just model and guided practice, which we'll go through what significant details are, what they look like, what we do when we find them, and we'll go through the cluster diagram, and then we'll go through guided practice. And that just with lesson 2, they're different stories. These stories are going to be more in their 10th grade reading level, so this will be a little bit harder for some of my students on my caseload. And then in lesson 3, we're going to review through guided practice, and then we're going to do an activity, which is guided practice, and then we're going to do unguided practice at the end of our class time. So parts of this lesson have already been done in lessons 1 and even 2. And then for students joining us in lesson 2, because lesson 2 will be in the co-taught literature classroom for the first time, this will be a review for them, which is good, and this will be good review for my students as well. My engagement strategies for my lesson are think, pair, share for a majority of the questions, and then partner first for another majority of the questions. And most of the time for partner first, I'm going to have the students pair up and then write out a definition together or write out their answer together, and then I'll call on the students. And then another engagement strategy I have is choral reading. Describe how you will connect new learning to previous learning in the lesson opening. So in their previous unit, they were talked about main ideas and what they are. So I will, in the opening of my lesson, I will talk about the main idea. I'm going to ask what the main idea is, and I will describe the main idea for review. And then we need to talk about how we know the main idea is correct, which will lead into the unit of finding significant details that support the main idea, because that's supporting the main idea being correct. Critical components. Okay, so for think out loud, I will be doing that in lesson 1 through the model and guided practice, mainly through the model. And so for this, I will be talking about finding significant details, what they look like, what we do when we find them, etc. And I will be using the article, The Surprising History of Mother's Day, and I will tell students I'm going to be looking for details that support the main idea in this article, and I will tell my students that the main idea of this article is the history of Mother's Day. And then we have to find details that support history, and since history is about dates and stuff, I'm going to be looking for details that have dates, dates and years, people, and big events. And I'll also just demonstrate to students what I want them to do when they find significant details that support the main idea, which is taking their highlighter and highlighting it. And then after we're done highlighting the story, we're going to put our significant details under cluster diagrams so we can have a visual representation of details supporting the main idea. And we'll talk about how for a cluster diagram, we don't necessarily have to take word for word from the book or from the story. We can use paraphrasing, and sometimes we can even combine significant details into one sentence. And for lesson 2, I'm going to be doing that same think aloud process, but we're just using a different story that's a little above some of my kiddos' grade level on my caseload. We'll be talking about Icarus, which is a Greek myth about him flying too close to the sun, and so we'll be going through that process just with a different story. Describe what teachers and learners will do during the guided practice portions of the lesson. So during lesson 1 and 2, we'll be doing scaffolding, but gradually taking away the supports. In lesson 1, we're just going to start out with one story, and I will tell the students what we need to do to find significant details and how we show we found them. And Second story, I will ask students what we need to do to find significant details and how we show we found them. And then in story 3, I'm going to remind students, if necessary, what we do to find significant details and how we show that we found them. And supports will be gradually taken away. There will be more scaffolding and supports in lesson 1 than in lesson 3. And same with the cluster diagram for each story. The first cluster diagram will have more supports and scaffolds, and then the third cluster diagram will hopefully have just reminders and like very little supports. And during lesson 2, Miss Martin will be doing the guided practice, but I will suggest to her to do the tell, ask, remind process. But this will be over just one story, but the story is 6 pages long, so about every 2 pages we can release the scaffolds and supports to teach. So the learning tasks and activities will add value because my one activity is actually kind of review and practicing for my kiddos. Because this activity, they will have 2 stations, and both stations have a different story. So I have to go through, find the main idea, and then highlight significant details that support the main idea. And then they will have to show a teacher their work, and the teacher will correct it quickly and show the students where they're at and if they're going in the right direction or if they need guidance and supports. So this will be good for them because they'll be able to practice, and then us teachers will be able to see if our students are getting what we're understanding, getting what we're teaching them, not what they're understanding. So for options for tasks and activities, during the lesson, students have the option of using their textbooks on their iPads, have a physical copy of the textbook, or a printed out version of each story to follow along with. And then as a teacher, I will have the stories posted on either the smartboard, overhead, or Elmo, just depending on the classroom. I don't know what Miss Martin has per se. During unguided practice, students will have the option of highlighting the story either on their iPads or printed out copies of the story. We can't obviously highlight in their textbooks because, that's expensive. And then the cluster diagrams can either be done via paper or electronic. So I have pre-made a cluster diagram. If students choose to use the pre-made one, they can upload that to their iPad or they can have a printed out copy. And then, or students can make their own cluster diagram on paper or on their iPad. And then I picked having the option of using their iPad for some of the kiddos that might not be comfortable with their writing. So they'll have the option of using speech to text, and if they are not comfortable with their reading abilities, they will also have the option of listening to an audio version of the story on their iPad. That way they don't feel like they're behind, and we're using assistive technology to help them learn. So my unguided practice that represents valid individual assessment. So all my unguided practice is the same. Students will have to turn in stories, and then these stories will have to be highlighted, and the highlighted parts will be what the students determine to be significant details that support the main idea, and the teachers will have a guide of the story with highlights already done with them. And along with turning in the story, students will also have to turn in a cluster diagram with the main idea and significant details branching off from the main idea. And then based off that, the teachers will have to look at the student's highlighted story and the student's cluster diagram to see if they're making those connections, and will reference back to the teacher's already pre-highlighted story. And then through this assessment, we can see if students are understanding the connections that significant details and main ideas have. We can also look and see if students were on the right track of what we deemed to be a significant detail. And we also want to make sure their highlighted stories, the details that they highlighted in their stories, are being transferred over to their cluster diagram. Because if they're not, then we kind of have a bigger problem of we're not understanding the main idea and significant detail connection. So through those, we can assess individually where students are at. So to evaluate mastery for when there's options of assessment, students will still have to turn in a cluster diagram and highlighted story to either Miss Martin or myself. And then we're going to have to read through what they highlighted and again look at their cluster diagram and compare it to their highlighted story and the cluster diagram and then the teacher's highlighted story. And then this way we can look at students that we're a bit worried that might be struggling with this. I can focus a little bit more on my kiddos on my caseload to see if lesson 1 in my learning strategies classroom help them do lesson 2 and lesson 3, and then we can see just how all students are doing individually, or the students that we might not know how they're doing. How I will provide positive feedback throughout the lesson. When the students answer a question correctly, they're actively participating during the guided practice, or when students are working hard on their unguided practice, I will provide positive feedback. And for those that are staying on task, they will also be provided positive feedback. Errors anticipated in my lesson are the steps to find the significant details that support the main idea. I think that will be hard for some of the kids. And those steps are read the story, find the main idea, find and highlight significant details, and transfer those main idea and significant details to the cluster diagram. So the students do not know the steps. I'm going to start asking with lower level questions, such as what are you going to do when we're giving you a passage or story? They're going to say read. What are we going to do after we read the story? We're going to find the main idea. Do you remember what the big picture means? And then they'll be like, oh, main idea, if the previous question I asked didn't click for them. And then I'll ask, what are we finding to support the main idea? They'll say significant details. What do we do when we find the significant details? What graphic device are we using? Error correction procedures. So I will be giving corrective feedback, such as when a student doesn't know, I'll start with lower level questions to try and build off and guide the student to the correct answer. If the student answers a question incorrectly, I'll focus on the correct answer, not the incorrect answer. I'm going to use a pleasant tone, not sarcastic, because I think the student will feel attacked if I use a sarcastic tone. And I'm going to do delay testing with the students who got previous questions incorrect, so I can see if the student knows the answer or if I have to go back and help the student build off again. How I will review critical content in the closing of the lessons is I'm going to be providing questions to students, and they will either do think, pair, share, or partner first and then respond. And then there will be an exit ticket, so I can see if my students understand what I'm going through. A lot of the closing questions I have are, what's the main idea? What are significant details? What are examples of significant details? And then what are the steps to find significant details that support the main idea? Technology I will be using are iPads. And I think it adds value for those kids that are not comfortable with their reading it. Then they have the option to listen to audio, or if they're not comfortable with their handwriting, they will have the option to type or use speech to text. And this technology adds value through UDL, so students will have an option of how they want to show what they've learned, and they will not be stuck with paper and pencil if that's not what they're comfortable with.